From the Gert Boyle studio at OPB, this is Think Out Loud. I'm Dave Miller. It has been nearly 5 years since a deadly heat wave known as the heat dome hit the Pacific Northwest. The temperature reached 116 degrees in Portland and broke other records throughout the region. Hundreds of people died, including 69 in Multnomah County alone. As climate change makes extreme heat events more frequent and longer lasting, a new study from researchers at Portland State University found that heat-related illnesses in the largest metro areas in the country could double by 2040. That includes Seattle and Portland. In fact, the study found that these cities with aging populations and a lack of cooling infrastructure could bear an especially high public health burden. Vivek Shandas is a co-author of the study. He's a professor of Earth, Environment, and Society at PSU, and he joins us now. It's good to have you back on the show.
Great to be here, Dave. Thank you.
I'm curious just to start with this nearly 5-year anniversary of this so-called heat dome. How have you been thinking about this anniversary?
Yeah, well, first, we are really thinking a lot about the people who died. That's number one. It was really a clear evidence that the system that we've created to manage weather, manage extreme events, is not prepared. In fact, a piece that came out in The Guardian today about this study titled it a little dramatically as woefully unprepared. And I think that's really where I've gone with it. And ultimately, it's really three things that came out of it for me. The heat dome shattered the myth that Oregon is naturally protected from extreme heat. And so that was just a recognition, first and foremost. And then a second thing is that it put a human face on this. It was basically saying that a regional forecast is not enough, and these folks who are living alone, over 81% of the people who died were living alone, and they were older, they were renters, they were low income, and they had limited access to cooling infrastructure. And so it's not rocket science to know where there's going to be vulnerabilities when such extreme events hit.
In that case, it was the confluence of social vulnerability and then a kind of built environment vulnerability.
Yeah.
Both of those together.
Well, I actually attribute it to three fundamental pillars of resilience, which social is one of those. And that's really, do people have access to networks where they can get help? And that is whether it be mutual aid networks, whether it be friends, family, neighbors. Second is really around issues of the built environment. We're building things that are amplifying temperatures. We know from a campaign we did shortly after the heat wave to measure temperatures that it was between 17 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit difference just in a few blocks away from each other. So we know that the built environment mediates a lot of what we experience. And then third, I think it really comes down to institutional failures. I mean, we really don't have a institutional architecture and infrastructure that allows us to respond as quickly and as efficiently and as effectively when it comes to responding to extreme heat.
I want to turn to all of those more fully in a second,
Sure.
But heat waves, I don't think of them as being publicly talked about as the most dramatic effect of climate change. I mean, compared to, say, hurricanes or floods or wildfires, which are all exacerbated by climate change and are these dramatic media events. Mm-hmm. Then there's heat waves, which is, in general, it's more like, it's pretty hot. So how does heat compare to those other real things in terms of the impact on human health?
Yeah, well, I'll just start with a basic statistic in that heat waves annually kill more people nationally than all these other natural hazards combined. So the tricky part about this is that it's often considered an equal opportunity hazard, meaning though it's anything but equal. It really is a silent killer, and it kills those folks who are often least prepared and least aware of the heat and how it's going to affect their physiology and their community. And there's a reason why you and others don't think about it as quite as severe, is that we just don't have an office that manages heat. Like, there's no way to actually know what this is happening. It often falls through the cracks. It doesn't, and another reason it doesn't make the front page news often. Hurricanes and these other natural disasters often are the much more kind of upfront, very clear, impactful. You see the tree down, you see the tree on a building, you see the hurricane size and compared to the rest of the continent, and those are very dramatic images. Heat is very quiet. It kind of sneaks up on you. In fact, it sneaks up on the body itself, and physiologically, it starts to slowly work its way through your organs, through your respiratory system, and then eventually heat stroke and heat-related illness.
Now, I mentioned at the beginning of my intro the shocking number of deaths from the heat dome, but in this new study, you're not really looking into deaths. You're looking more broadly into heat-related illness. Why?
Right.
That's a pretty important distinction.
We believe it is. We wanted, deaths often get the frontline image. It's very blunt measure. It's kind of the last resort, if you will. What we wanted to recognize is that heat actually hurts a lot more people than that blunt measure of death. In fact, you think about the families, the jobs, the various community and social activities that operate with people actively involved in them. Though when you're ill, you can't do that. In fact, when you have heat stroke, when you have nausea, when you have dizziness, confusion, all these things that emerge from heat, you're not able to actively engage in those activities. And so it has a big productivity impact that we're just starting to quantify. And it also has a big impact on families and communities. And so that's where we start seeing, that's why we wanted to start putting a bit more of numbers, direct numbers to these heat-related illness, and then also start illustrating how this is going to grow over time, because we have a hunch that without the cooling infrastructure, without the active coordination of the regional entities, it's going to continue to grow.
I'm curious about the challenges in putting numbers here. I mean,
Yeah.
do doctors or nurses routinely write down, quote, heat-related, unquote, in some medical record, if someone comes in during a heat wave, even saying,
Right.
complaining of shortness of breath or dizziness, does that actually get captured in a medical record that
Right.
you as a researcher can come and find?
Very difficult to get that information. In fact, I'm in conversation with doctors, medical doctors around the country and world now that are trying to figure out what are essentially these ICD codes. These are codes that ambulance drivers, doctors, nurses put down as the primary impact and the reason for this person coming into the hospital or going into the ambulance. And often these ICD codes do not directly attribute it to heat. In fact, it's what we call a heat-adjacent illness. That's like someone has asthma and the heat exacerbates that asthma and they get an asthma attack that drives them to the hospital. Turns out that gets coded as asthma, not heat.
So
Even
then
though
how
heat
do
was
you
attributed.
handle that as a researcher?
It's a lot of real conservative approaches to this. So this study that we published today, and it just landed this morning on American Geophysical Union's journal, is an attempt to take a very conservative approach, saying we have a handful of heat waves that we're looking at around the country, and we have really good records of those that were only coded as a heat-related illness. And when you take those, not the heat-adjacent illness, not any of those, only take those as a heat-coded illness, and that allows us to then start extrapolating from those empirical measurements into what we see as some of the attributes or some of the co-mediating factors that affect their health and well-being in the long run.
You've been studying this issue in various ways for a while. You've been on our show talking about shade, about equity, about the built environment in a way that affects the heat in a particular place for a while. So I'm curious if you were surprised by anything in your new study.
Yeah, we're surprised by several things. One of the things that came up was simply that, we cannot, when we only count deaths, we're dramatically underestimating the true cost of extreme heat. We really wanted to emphasize that information by itself does not drive action. And we found that when you put dollar values behind these kinds of assessments, that can nudge decision makers to think more seriously about investing in this. And so what the result of that is that when you put numbers on it, we can start to then characterize and quantify what the total impacts are. And that was one major surprise. The other, and just the scale of it. And just the second piece is that it really varies quite a bit across the country. This was a national study of 53 metro regions. And we're finding that places in the West, for example, they have the highest count of heat-related illnesses. They will increase the most in the coming decades, and that's largely because there's growth of population occurring in the West as opposed to the Midwest, and however, for each event interestingly, the Ohio River Valley and the Midwest and the Northeast have very severe impacts. And that's largely because the cooling infrastructure in these northern latitudes is not really there. Whereas when you look at like today is 103 in Phoenix, Arizona, right? And later this week, we'll get 90 plus degree temperatures in this region. And what we're finding is that we are not, much of the Midwest, Ohio River Valley, the Northwest is not well equipped to manage it. And so when you model this out to 2040, which is almost like our crystal ball to kind of see what works and what doesn't work, and what are the impacts, we start seeing that the actual effects of not having green space, not having air conditioning and cooling infrastructure, not having cooling centers and places that people can go for help during these extreme heat events, all those things add up to essentially drive these higher levels of heat-related illness.
There have been efforts in Oregon at the state level and the local level in Portland to proactively respond to this in recent years. I'm thinking about the Portland Clean Energy Community Benefits Fund, or PSEF, a voter-passed fund, which is, for example, to get low-income Portlanders access to heat pumps. What have you learned about the effectiveness of this program?
Yeah, this is an incredible program. I'm so grateful that the residents and community members and nonprofits all rallied to get this PSEF program established, and I'm a big fan. It's really addressing the front line of some of these challenges that we're dealing with, because a big part of the challenge is, of course, money. Being able to have staff to respond to heat, being able to get the weatherization in homes so that when it is hot outside, your indoor environment stays cool. It is about getting the green spaces and the tree canopy robust so that we can get enough shade into our neighborhoods that are baking from the heat. And so all of those are great. The tricky part about these programs is when you're rolling out lots of money and putting in heat pumps into an indoor space, we don't know whether those residents are going to use that heat pump or not. In fact, some early evidence that we're starting to interview residents around the region who have recently received these heat pumps, we're finding that there is some limited amount of use of these heat pumps depending on kind of who you talk to. So for a wealthy household, for example, at 80 degrees, they'll turn on the heat pump and the air conditioner. A lower income household doesn't turn on that AC until 100, 105, maybe even 110 degrees.
Because the energy bill is going to be too much.
Prohibitive. That's right. There's two reasons. One is we've narrowed down to cost, and that is they see that on their energy bill. And the second is simply that it's a new technology, and that new technology is unfamiliar. And so there's some getting used to that technology that's still not quite there.
Well, so what policy recommendations do you think, in your mind, follow from your new study?
Yeah, so we really need to be first engaging a lot of the hospitals and medical and public health agencies. They are the front line. They're the ones who are often seeing this very laid bare. And we need to be really coding heat-related illness much more directly and clearly so that researchers like me and others have really good evidence and understanding of what is the scale of the problem. Part of why we developed this study is to really illustrate the scale. The second is to really start thinking about that a regional forecast doesn't by itself give you what you need. You need much more local, granular data and understanding of kind of what happens in the morning, afternoon, and evening in a particular city block in a particular neighborhood. So I would want us to really start moving into these kind of what we call regional observation networks, where we can actually start understanding the changes of temperature that's happening at a block scale. And then third, I'd really want our institutions to start getting trained in heat preparedness protocols. Like, we need to get transportation behind this. We need to get housing behind this. We need to get emergency managers thinking about this more directly. We need to get public health behind this.
It's going to be somewhere in the 90s in parts of Oregon this weekend, going into the next week.
Yeah.
You have about 50 seconds for this, but is there a temperature threshold where you think, that's not 116, but at what point do you start worrying?
Yeah, well, I will say quickly that 116 was the airport temperature. I was measuring 125 in some neighborhoods, and in that same hours measuring 100 to 99 to 100 in other neighborhoods. So we are seeing, as temperatures go up, that disparity of exposure getting really, really more more clear. And I think for this coming week and weekend, one of the things that I'm really hopeful for is that we are building communication systems to reach those communities that are historically not getting access to the information that public health alerts and these other systems that are out there. So we need to develop some more communication systems to be able to get at those in manufactured homes, mobile home parks, multifamily residential, and the like.
Vivek, thanks very much.
Thanks, Dave. Good to be here.
Vivek Shandas is a professor of Earth, Environment, and Society at Portland State University. We'll be back after a short break.